A millionaire humiliated his black ex-wife at the airport until an $80 million jet arrived to pick her up. Are you sure you belong here? The question cut through the air in the VIP lounge like a sharp blade, causing all the other passengers to discreetly turn their heads. Richard Thornton stood before his ex-wife with that arrogant smile she knew all too well, holding a glass of champagne as if it were a trophy of war. Diana Williams, 38, sat calmly in an Italian leather armchair, not even blinking. She held a simple coffee cup in her hands, wearing a discreet blazer she had bought at a department store. At Richard's side, his new wife, a platinum blonde with perfectly manicured nails, recorded everything on her cell phone, letting out muffled giggles. Seriously, Dee. Richard continued, using the nickname that was once affectionate, now turned into mockery. This place is for people of, how can I put it, a certain social standing. Don't you think it would be more appropriate to wait in the common area? The silence in the room was deafening. Other passengers, executives in expensive suits, socialites with designer handbags, watched the scene as if they were watching a live reality show. Diana could feel the curious glances, some amused, others embarrassed. It was exactly the kind of spectacle Richard loved to create, her as the humiliated protagonist of his fantasies of superiority. "Leave her alone, honey," Richard's wife murmured loud enough for everyone to hear. "Maybe she's cleaning here. It's an honest job." Diana breathed slowly, her fingers squeezing the strap of her simple handbag almost imperceptibly. 5 years ago, she had walked away from that marriage with nothing but her dignity and a small consulting firm that Richard considered child's play. What he didn't know, what no one in that room could have imagined, was that this little game had turned into something that would make his fortune look like pocket change. "You've always been good at pretending you belong in places you shouldn't be," Richard continued, clearly intoxicated by his own cruelty. "Remember when you insisted on going to company dinners? Always so out of place." Diana finally looked up, meeting his gaze with a calmness that seemed to come from somewhere very deep inside. There was no anger there, no humiliation, just the serenity of someone who knew exactly where she was and why she was there. "I'm waiting for my flight, Richard," she said simply, her clear, firm voice cutting through the low noise in the room. "Your flight?" Richard laughed loudly, looking around as if he wanted everyone to share in the joke. "Where to? Back to your tiny apartment? How many layovers will you need?" What Richard couldn't see, what his arrogance prevented him from noticing, was that Diana didn't look like a defeated woman waiting for an economy flight. There was something in her posture, in the way her eyes sparkled when she looked at him, that suggested this conversation was about to take a very different turn than he imagined. While Richard savored every cruel word, Diana maintained that mysterious serenity of someone who keeps a secret too powerful to be revealed before the right time. A secret that was just minutes away from turning that VIP lounge into the scene of the greatest reversal of power those people would ever witness. Richard was clearly enjoying the spectacle he had created, walking around Diana's armchair like a predator circling its prey, gesturing theatrically to the improvised audience of first-class passengers who were now openly watching the scene. "You don't know Diana," he announced to the room as if introducing a circus act. "She's always had this, how can I put it? This tendency to fantasize about a life she could never have. Remember when you insisted on going to my company events, honey? Always trying to mingle with real people." Richard's wife, who had introduced herself to anyone who would listen as Brittany, lifestyle influencer, laughed loudly as she adjusted the angle of her cell phone. "Honey, you're being too kind. Tell them about her make-believe company." Diana closed her eyes for a moment, not out of embarrassment, but as if she were mentally reviewing a very important list. Richard interpreted this as vulnerability and intensified his attack. "Oh yes, the famous Williams Consulting," he said, making air quotes. She rented a 2-square-meter office in a run-down commercial building and pretended to be a business consultant. Do you know how much she made per month? Less than I spent on wine. What Richard didn't know, what his blinding arrogance prevented him from discovering, was that Diana had spent the last 5 years working 18 hours a day, transforming the 2-square-meter office into the headquarters of an operation that now moved sums that would make the Thornton family fortune look like pocket money. During the divorce, Richard had been meticulous in ensuring that Diana walked away with nothing of significance. His lawyers had dissected every asset, every account, every investment. But they had made one fatal mistake. They completely underestimated the ability of a determined black woman to rebuild her life from scratch. I remember when she cried in court, Richard continued, now completely drunk on his own cruelty, begging to keep half the house off, as if she had contributed anything other than taking up space. The flashback of that day was still vivid in Diana's mind, the cold, impersonal courtroom where Richard and his 3 expensive lawyers had systematically destroyed any claim she had made about her participation in his business success. They had painted a picture of a woman who had married for money and now wanted an undeserved slice of the empire Richard had built single-handedly. Your Honor, Richard's lead attorney had said that day, Mo Williams never took an active role in my client's business. She has no formal education in business administration, no proven track record in business, and frankly, she does not demonstrate the skills necessary to manage the complex assets she is claiming. Diana had left that courtroom with only a small financial settlement and the humiliation of having been portrayed as an incompetent opportunist. But she had also left with something Richard's lawyers could never have predicted, a burning motivation that made her work harder than she had ever worked in her life. The funny thing, Richard said, now turning directly to Diana, is that you always thought you deserved to be in places like this. But look where you are now, alone, broke, probably in debt, waiting for an economy flight to some irrelevant place. Brittany let out another shrill laugh. Honey, show her our destination. We're going to the Bahamas on his parents' private jet. First class isn't even first class when you have your own jet. This was the moment when Diana should have been squirming with humiliation, begging them to stop, or simply running out of the room with her tail between her legs. It was exactly the reaction Richard expected to validate his sense of superiority. Instead, Diana opened her eyes and looked at Richard with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. There was no anger there, no humiliation, no despair. There was something that looked almost like pity. Are you done, Richard? She asked calmly, checking the time on the simple watch she wore on her wrist. Finished, Richard laughed, but for the first time, his laughter sounded a little forced. Honey, I've barely begun. Do you want me to tell these people what our sex life was like? Or maybe how you used to beg me not to end the marriage? A middle-aged man in an expensive gray suit, who had been reading a financial newspaper by the window, slowly lowered the paper and watched the scene with an expression of barely concealed disgust. An elegant silver-haired lady shook her head, clearly embarrassed by Richard's behavior. Diana realized that the tide was beginning to turn. People in the room were beginning to realize that they were not witnessing a casual encounter between ex-spouses, but rather a deliberate act of public cruelty. Richard, Diana said, and something in her tone made him stop laughing immediately. In 5 years, you haven't changed a bit. You're still the same small man who needs to belittle others to feel big. Small. Richard's voice rose a notch, losing its cultivated air of superiority. I own 3 companies. I have an 8-figure net worth. You don't even have a single digit. It was then that Diana smiled, not a forced or defensive smile, but a genuine, calm smile from someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. And in that moment, for the first time in the entire conversation, Richard felt a twinge of uncertainty. You're right, Diana said, rising gracefully and smoothing her blazer. I don't actually have an 8-figure net worth. Richard visibly relaxed, ready to savor the admission of defeat. I have 9. The silence that followed was so deep that you could hear the almost imperceptible hum of the room's air conditioning system. Richard blinked several times as if Diana's words were a foreign language he was trying to decipher. "Sorry, what did you say?" Brittany murmured, lowering her cell phone for the first time since the recording began. But Diana didn't repeat herself. Instead, she looked toward the entrance of the room where an airport employee had just appeared with a slightly anxious expression on her face. Every cruel word Richard had uttered in the last 15 minutes had only served to confirm what Diana already knew, that he was still the same arrogant, insecure man who had underestimated a black woman 5 years ago, and that he was about to pay the price for that arrogance in the most public and humiliating way possible. Diana's claim of having 9 figures hung in the air of the VIP lounge like a bomb about to explode. Richard blinked repeatedly, his mind trying to process information that simply did not make sense in the universe where he was the absolute center. 9? What? Brittany stammered, looking between Diana and Richard as if expecting someone to shout, "It's a prank." Richard forced a laugh that came out more like a nervous bark. "Diana, you're delusional. 9 figures. You barely had $9 when we split up. Stop fantasizing and accept that your life has become a complete failure." The airport employee approached discreetly, carrying an elegant clipboard. "Ms. Williams, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I have an update on your flight." Diana turned to the young woman with a gentle smile, completely ignoring Richard, who continued to babble incredulously. "Yes, dear. Tell me. Your pilot has just confirmed that you are ready for boarding. Mr. Morrison is on his way to escort you to the aircraft." Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. Morrison. He knew that name. David Morrison was one of the most expensive and influential lawyers on the East Coast, the kind of man who charged $1,000 a minute for a consultation and only accepted clients with a net worth of over $100 million. "There must be some mistake," Richard muttered, but his voice had lost all its previous arrogance. "Diana doesn't even have enough money to pay for a duty lawyer, let alone David Morrison." It was then that the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place in Diana's mind, taking her back to the exact day her life had changed forever. 3 years ago, she was in her tiny apartment eating instant noodles for the 5th night in a row, when she received a phone call that would change everything. "Ms. Williams," said the voice on the other end of the line. "This is Jennifer Chun from TechVantage Consulting. We've heard about your work with micro-entrepreneurs and would like to propose a partnership." Diana almost laughed. TechVantage was one of the largest technology consulting firms in the world, specializing in turning small businesses into corporate giants. The idea that they even knew she existed seemed absurd. "I think you have the wrong number," Diana had replied, looking around her 40-square-meter apartment. "On the contrary, we've analyzed your cases from the last 2 years. You've turned 17 small businesses into profitable operations using methodologies that our team considers revolutionary." What Jennifer didn't know, what no one knew, was that Diana had developed those. During the sleepless nights after her divorce, Diana channeled her pain into an obsession with proving that she could rebuild lives, just as she was rebuilding her own. The partnership with TechVantage had been the first step. Within 6 months, she was consulting for companies that moved millions. Within a year, she was creating strategies for multinational corporations. Within 2 years, she had founded her own consulting firm with offices in 6 countries. The real masterstroke had come 8 months ago when Diana discovered that Richard was trying to sell his companies to cover debts he had hidden from everyone, including Brittany. Diana didn't just buy one of his companies through a third party. She bought all 3, and Richard never knew that his black ex-wife, whom he had humiliated in court as incompetent in business, was now literally his boss. "Ms. Williams," a deep familiar voice echoed through the room. David Morrison had arrived, impeccable in his tailored suit, carrying an Italian leather briefcase that probably cost more than most people's cars. Richard visibly paled. Seeing him in the same room as Diana was not a coincidence. It was confirmation that his ex-wife was operating at a level he had never imagined possible. "David," Diana said, rising gracefully, "how are the meetings in New York?" "Productive. The acquisition of Thornton's last company was finalized yesterday afternoon. The documents are ready for your review during the flight." The sound that came out of Richard's throat was somewhere between a groan and a muffled cry. Brittany dropped her cell phone, finally understanding that something very serious was happening. "Wait," Richard said, his voice high-pitched with panic. "What acquisition? My companies are not for sale." Morrison turned to Richard with the expression of someone who had just noticed something unpleasant on the sole of his shoe. "Mr. Thornton, what a coincidence to find you here. Actually, your companies weren't for sale. They were in debt enforcement. My client simply offered a better price than your creditors." Diana watched Richard's face go through all the stages of grief in a matter of seconds. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression. The realization that he had lost everything to the woman he considered a failure was more devastating than any physical humiliation could be. "That's not possible," Richard muttered more to himself than to anyone else. "I checked the finances every week. I had control of everything." "You did," Morrison corrected coldly. "Before your series of questionable investments and the 3 lawsuits for moral harassment that cost $15 million in out-of-court settlements." Brittany finally found her voice. "Richard, what is he talking about? What lawsuits?" It was Diana who answered with calmness that made the temperature in the room seem to drop a few degrees. "Apparently, Richard didn't tell you about the former employees he harassed. Dear, or about the loans he took out using the companies as collateral to finance his lifestyle." The entire room was now witnessing the real-time collapse of a man who had spent the last 15 minutes publicly humiliating his ex-wife. Some passengers discreetly took out their cell phones, realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. "Diana," Richard said, and for the first time, his voice carried something approaching desperation. We can talk. Work this out. You don't have to destroy everything I've built." Diana tilted her head, studying the face of the man who had tried to annihilate her self-esteem and credibility 5 years earlier. "Funny, Richard. When I begged you not to humiliate me in court, when I asked you to maintain a minimum of respect, what was your response again?" Richard swallowed hard, knowing exactly what he had said that day. "You don't deserve respect. You never have." Morrison glanced discreetly at his watch. "Ms. Williams, if you're ready, we could board. The flight to Singapore is scheduled to take off in 20 minutes. Singapore. Richard knew this detail because he had tried unsuccessfully to secure a contract with a technology company there the previous month. A company that he now realized probably belonged to Diana. Diana picked up her simple handbag, which Richard now realized was actually a discreet and extremely expensive piece from an exclusive European brand, and smiled at Morrison. "I'm ready." As she headed for the exit, each step echoed like a final sentence for Richard, who remained frozen, watching his entire life crumble before his eyes. But there was something in Diana's smile, a quiet satisfaction, that suggested today's public humiliation had been merely the appetizer of a much more elaborate feast of justice she had been preparing for years, and that Richard was about to discover that losing his companies was only the first course. Wait, Richard said, his voice rising in panic as he ran after Diana and Morrison toward the VIP room exit. "You can't just buy my companies. That's not legal." Morrison calmly stopped and turned, opening his Italian briefcase with the precision of a surgeon. "Mr. Thornton, would you like to review the documents? Here is the $4.2 million tax default enforcement order." He held out an official paper. "And here, the $2.8 million unpaid labor debt enforcement order. And this particularly interesting document. Richard snatched the papers from Morrison's hands, his eyes desperately scanning the official stamps and court signatures. Each line he read, his face grew paler. "This document," Morrison continued, pointing to a specific page, "is the execution of a sentence for moral and sexual harassment against 3 former employees, $15.5 million in moral and punitive damages, plus court costs." Brittany, who had been recording everything as if it were content for her social media, slowly lowered her phone. "Richard, what employees? What harassment? You told me these women were trying to take advantage of you. It's not quite like that." Richard stammered, still trying to process the documents in his hands. "Oh, but it is exactly like that," said Diana, turning to face him for the first time since the conversation began. "Brittany, dear, didn't your boyfriend tell you about Jessica, the marketing analyst he stalked for months until she quit? Or about Carmen, the accountant he blackmailed into keeping quiet about tax irregularities?" Richard swallowed hard. "Diana, you don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, but I know everything, Richard." Diana opened her simple purse and took out a sleek tablet. "Jessica came to me 2 years ago. She had saved all the emails, all the text messages, all the recordings of the private meetings you insisted on having with her after hours." "Ms. Williams, I should mention that the Financial Journal reporter you contacted must be finishing the article on corporate fraud at this very moment. Publication is scheduled for 6 p.m. Eastern Time." Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. What article? Diana, what have you done?" "I served justice," Diana replied with a calmness that made the room's temperature seem to drop a few degrees. "Do you remember the journalist Michael Chun from the Financial Journal? He's been investigating harassment schemes at tech companies. When I handed him 5 years of documented evidence, recordings, emails, and witnesses, he was absolutely fascinated." Diana slid her finger across the tablet screen again. "The title of the article is Richard Thornton, How a CEO Built an Empire Through Harassment and Tax Fraud. It's a really interesting read, Richard. They even use that photo of you from Fortune magazine, you know. The one where you're smiling proudly next to the phrase, CEO of the Year." Richard began to shake visibly. It wasn't just the money, it wasn't just the companies, it was his reputation. His name, everything he had worked and lied and manipulated for over 2 decades. "Diana, please." His voice now carried real desperation. "We can work this out. I can pay you not to publish this story. We can make a deal." Diana tilted her head, studying him like an entomologist observing a particularly interesting insect. "A deal like the one you offered me in court 5 years ago, when your lawyer said I should accept my place and stop being too ambitious? That was different. It was exactly the same thing, Richard. You always thought you could buy, intimidate, or humiliate anyone who was inconvenient to you. The only difference is that this time you picked the wrong person." Brittany finally found her voice, but it came out as a harsh whisper. "Richard, these women, did they really? Did you really do those things?" Richard opened and closed his mouth several times like a fish out of water. His ability to lie convincingly had been completely destroyed by the weight of the evidence Diana had against him. Things were taken out of context. Context? Diana laughed, but there was no joy in the sound. "Brittany, you want to know about context? Let me tell you about when Richard tried to blackmail the city mayor for illegal tax breaks, or when he bribed a federal inspector to ignore environmental violations. All properly documented and about to be published." Morrison checked his screen. "Ms. Williams, I just received confirmation that federal tax authorities have issued a search and seizure warrant for the offices of Thornton Industries. It must be being executed right now." Richard let out a sound that was half moan, half muffled scream. clutching the arm of a nearby chair as his legs failed to support him. This can't be happening," he muttered. "I was in control. I had everything under control." "You did," Diana agreed. "Until you underestimated the incompetent black woman you publicly humiliated and left with nothing. That was your greatest weakness, Richard. You could never imagine that someone you considered inferior could be smarter than you." Diana turned to Brittany, who was clearly in shock. "Brittany, dear, if I were you, I would check your joint finances. Federal investigations tend to freeze all related assets during investigations. And considering that Richard registered you as common-law spouses." Brittany's eyes widened in horror. "What does that mean?" "It means," Morrison said in a professional tone, "that any shared property or accounts may be temporarily inaccessible during the criminal investigation, including the house in Miami you bought last month." Brittany turned to Richard with fury that completely transformed her Barbie doll face. "Richard, you told me the money was clean. You said we had a future together. We do. I'll fix this. How?" Brittany screamed, her voice echoing through the VIP lounge. "You lost everything, and now I've lost everything too because of your lies." An airport employee approached discreetly. "Excuse me, is there a problem here? Other passengers are complaining about the noise." Diana smiled kindly at the employee. "There's no problem at all. We were just finishing our conversation." She turned to Richard one last time. "Richard, one last thing. Do you remember that board meeting where you said people like me can't build anything lasting because we don't have the necessary strategic intelligence?" Richard nodded mechanically, clearly too stunned to process it. Diana smiled, and for the first time, the smile carried genuine satisfaction. "I built a $400 million empire. And do you know what my first strategic acquisition was? A small digital media company specializing in investigative journalism. They contacted Michael Chun for me." The final revelation hit Richard like a bolt of lightning. It hadn't been luck. It hadn't been coincidence. Diana had orchestrated every aspect of his downfall with the precision of a master chess player. "Diana." Richard tried one last time, his voice broken and desperate. "Goodbye, Richard," Diana said, picking up her simple purse. "I hope you learned something from this, but honestly, I'm not optimistic." She turned to Morrison. "Shall we go? Our flight to Singapore awaits." As Diana and Morrison walked toward the exit, leaving behind a completely devastated Richard and a tearful Brittany, everyone in the room witnessed one of the most complete reversals of power they had ever seen. As Diana gracefully climbed the steps of the private jet, she carried with her not only the satisfaction of justice served, but also one last gift she had saved. Especially for this moment, a surprise that would turn that personal victory into something much bigger and more lasting than anyone could have imagined. 6 months later, Diana was on the cover of Forbes as CEO of the Year, her company valued at $800 million. Richard, ruined and under investigation by the FBI, had lost everything: his companies, his home, his reputation. Brittany had left him when she discovered his hidden debts. He saw her for the last time in a simple cafe. Diana smiled kindly as she walked past his table, where he was drinking cheap coffee, wearing thrift store clothes. "Richard," she said calmly, "I hope you've learned that true strength doesn't come from humiliating others, but from building something greater than your fears." Richard just nodded, finally understanding the magnitude of the mistake he had made in underestimating an extraordinary woman. Diana's revenge wasn't cruel, it was perfect. She proved that success is the best response to those who try to diminish you. Today, her foundation offers scholarships to Black female entrepreneurs, turning pain into power, showing that anyone you humiliate might be building the empire that will one day destroy yours.